Hi, and welcome to week 3. So, at the end of this week, you'll be halfway done with the course. I hope that it's going really well. This week, you have the midterm, and I'm trusting that you guys are just hopefully getting stuff out of that out of this class that you'll remember and want to share with people in the future. So, today we're going to talk about Sub-Saharan Sahara. Sub-Saharan Africa. Um, if you look at this is the physiography map, you can see the different structures and basins that we have that affect where people live, whether crops are grown there, is there access to another area. So we're going to look at the fact that this continent is flanked by the Atlantic Ocean and the Indian Ocean. And then at the bottom, it goes, the Southern Ocean is what's down there. So the massive Congo River basin in the middle is a rainforest like the Amazon rainforest. It's relatively impenetrable. It has a wild diversity of flora and fauna that has not been looked at yet. If you look towards the south, you have the Kalahari Basin, and the Kalahari Basin comes down from the rivers and has the Okavango Delta there, which has been drying out in recent years. This is where you have huge wildlife park. The elephants have been migrating from there because there has been such unreliable water. One thing that they just found is that they believe that there are large quantities of oil and gas in the Kalahari Basin, and they're putting a permit in to try and drill an exploratory well to see if there is oil and gas there. And they say they're going to minimize their footprints, put a few roads in, only, drill it or during the day so it doesn't disturb the animals at night. So we're going to have to see how that plays out. If you look, oops, if you look to the right where you have the Lake Victoria that moves all the way up to the Ethiopian highlands, this is actually an area where the plate is breaking apart. And this new magma is coming up, and as it comes up, it pushes it even further apart. So you have this chain of volcanoes that are running up this portion of sub-Saharan Africa. And where you have that, you have these depressions where you can collect water. So you have Lake Victoria there. There's a series of lakes there that are being produced when the land is opening up and they're collecting the rainwater. What you also have in this area, because of it, is fertile soil, because volcanic soil is some of the most fertile soil. It's a good place to have agriculture. And also it is at an elevation, so you're not dealing with this dry desert heat anymore. You're actually in an area where you have a humid continental climate until you get high enough where they actually have peaks that have snow on them up here. If you look up across the Gold Coast, go back one for this. Gold Coast is the southwestern coast from Senegal all the way around through Cameroon. You see this nice layer of green, and this is area where you also have tropical forests, so there is water here that's available, and you have large ecosystems. And then you have the deserts, and if you look, you have the Sahara Desert to the north. Down along the southwestern coast is the Namib Desert. So this really is an area of large contrasts. You'll have one great Amazon, or you have one great rainforest basin next to a desert, next to volcanoes, and it's very complex. So where to settle here in all with all these different environments is going to be a really, I think, neat thing for us to look into through today's lecture. Um, One of the things that is interesting is look at the rivers. And we have in the north the White Nile River and the Blue Nile River, which come down from the highlands up near Lake Victoria, and it ends up flowing out through Egypt. You have a series over on the Gold Coast from the Niger. And then you have a complex down on the southeastern area where you have them coming out. But there are large portions of the area that don't have a large river, and some of these aren't navigable. So even though you have river there, it's not one that you can get to take from point A to point B. The right side of this slide shows the Sahel. And the Sahel is a really interesting region. Um, North of it is the, the Sahara, and then south of it is the Gold Coast. And this is a transition zone where you should have grasslands capable for having good farming, good arable land, places for grazing animals. So it's been a transition zone between the rainforest and the desert. And one of the things that's happening now with climate change is that this area is drying out. It's a process called desertification, which means it's turning into a desert. So the people who lived here or who still live here and the animals and stuff are, if this becomes not a place where they can live, they're going to have to migrate. And I don't think we've talked about it yet, but they're called environmental refugees. And it's when the place that you have been living becomes no longer habitable or prosperous for you to be able to have a living. And we're seeing more and more environmental refugees on multiple continents, just because where they've lived for hundreds of years can no longer support them or their family. All right, so let's look at history. Africa is the cradle for humans. From here, they spread out across the globe. We know very little about it until about 500 years ago, about the interior of Africa. There were many groups of people. We don't have much written history before then. And the colonizers, when they came, they disrupted so many of the African traditions, and they destroyed artifacts that we know even less than we could know about them. The first major trade that came from outside Africa were the Romans. They went to West African coast. They were looking for a way to get to Asia and stopped along Africa. As groups of people kept coming here, these became major cultural centers. These centers began to develop because you had things from the interior of Africa that were coming to go out, and then you had new things that were being brought in from ships from other areas in the world coming in. The Nok was one of the biggest, most well-known groups that established it there. So at the same time, you have intra-African trade, and these are the goods from the tropical forests are traded with from stuff from cultural groups of the dry lands and the savannas. And this was called a complementary relationship because each was able to give someone the other group that they didn't have, and in turn all got what they needed. Now, as trading grew and the access to good became more prevalent, urban centers started to form. And Timbuktu, which is in Mali now, as you can see up above the Gold Coast, and then Ghana. Both of these were very stable people groups. So we're looking at the fact that they would be governed with long-term stability. They even had taxes, they had tolls, a city center, an army. And Ghana and Nok were really cultural hearts of inspiration and culture and art and science that eventually would go and be spread to the rest of the world. Now, the Muslims from the north invaded. So what happened next was what they called the Great Bantu Migration. And this was about 5,000. Forget what I said about the Muslims. We're not there yet. So the Great Bantu Migration, about 5,000 years ago, the influences from Egypt and other cultures to the north started coming down. They carried crop cultivation, weapons, religion, and they were the ones who were helping to create the people groups of Africa. They were creating these cultures. Um, the empires, that main empires that were formed there, the Zulu, the Zimbabwe, the Angola, um, before Europeans came, these were in a lot of different places, but they had lifestyles and customs and religions and agricultures that actually allowed them to interact. And if you look at this next slide, this is the ethnic areas of sub-Saharan Africa, and you can see just how many different people groups there were there and that were interacting with each other at the time, and exchanging culture and ideas, and some of those ethnic groups are still around today. It was just heavily peopled by a lot of different uh, cultures, and yet somehow it was integrated for a while. Now, the Europeans were looking for routes to get to the Orient, looking for sea routes so they didn't have to go overland. And pretty soon, these coastal ports on West Africa, the Gold Coast, and Angola, um, were used. They traded for gold and spices, and then they started trading for slaves from the interior. These ports grew because they were really big centers of activity. Um, More than 30 million people, it is thought, were sent to the New World, the Brazil, Caribbean, and the Americas. There were large scale raids of the interior of Africa to bring more slaves. Um, and then at this point, a lot of the cultures of interior Africa that had been thriving, were breaking down because they were being raided and whole groups of people, being taken away. So through all of this, the interior states that were being raided and torn apart and shredded, they went into decline while the coastal cities grew with more commerce. So when colonization finally became illegal, and in the second half of the 19th century, when slavery became illegal, Europe decided it was going to colonize Africa. Britain, France, Portugal, Belgium, and Germany, they actually got around a map in Germany and they drew lines and divided up the continent. By 1910, they had taken over the entire continent of Africa, and each of these different governments governed differently in the areas where they were the colonizers. And so they've each left a different imprint on their former territories. The British always liked indirect rule, and that's where they would take the local people who were in charge and they would let them, govern the area. The Portuguese were very much oppressors. They wanted direct control over the entire country, economics, politics. It doesn't matter. That's what they wanted. The French tried to make it like France, and they wanted to create an elite rule, and that French ideals would be what would support the country or undergird the country. And Belgium, King Leopold wanted it for his own. So he went in and he raided it, and it said that more than 10 million people were killed through his regime. So most of Africa became independent in the 1960s. And a lot of these countries had only been colonized for 50 to 80 years, but the legacies and the imprint on the colonies was massive. There was ethnic fragmentation, as we talked about, whole groups being destroyed, moved apart from each other. no large scale infrastructure had been done in Africa, so they didn't even have the benefit of being able to get from here to there. Um, Large scale agriculture was popular, and so they would do monocropping. They would go in, strip the land, and then they would put a single crop in. And then when they left, that was the legacy that the people in those countries had. Um, the excuse me, they took they cut forests down. They had exploited minerals, created pollution in the rivers. Um, and so coming out of that, even after it was quote unquote only colonized for a short period of time, and they've only had their freedom for a short period of time, the effects are extremely deleterious. And we'll have to see where we go from there. So next, let's talk about population. Um, as you can see, people are living in the coastal areas and the fertile mountains in the east on the river valley of the Rift Valley. Much of this is a legacy from trading areas away from hardly habitable places or places of great mineral wealth, good climates. In the south, just South Africa on the southeast corner, that area is called the High Veld, and that area is one of the most diamond rich places in the world. And so you have a lot of people, the government, a lot of people from surrounding countries where they can't find jobs coming to work in those mines and then send remittances back. So you had areas that were formerly cities, you have areas that had good mineral wealth that they could do. Ones along the Great Rift where you have water and fertile soil. These are the main places that people are gathering. Most of the places here, though, if you look at it, are not resilient, as we talked about before. If something happens, then is there enough of a governmental rule or system set up where if there was a devastating effect that they would be able to come and recover from it? Not very resilient. All right. One good thing that they do have is they have water. And one of the problems is that there's water there, it just hasn't been tapped. So if you want to have agriculture in some of these places, it just takes someone coming in and helping and giving money to drill a well and pump the water out to be able to have even better agricultural system, fresh drinking water. It's one of the things that's available, and if it could just get tapped in everywhere, then the quality of life would go up immeasurably. And one of the documentaries I watched also said that a lot of girls have to stop at it, have to drop out of school, while they're in grade school, because they have to help carry the water from one place to another, from the river to their home. And that if they don't have these tasks to do, they could stay in school for several hours longer a day than they currently are. All right, so there are vast mineral resources. Africa is by far the richest continent in the world for mineral resources. We've talked about rare earth elements like yttrium and cobalt. Um, these resources are found in great quantities in Africa. And if you look at just the tech industry alone, um, getting some of these resources from that portion of Africa would be good. One of the problems is that because it's not regulated, there's a lot of child labor in these places, unsafe working conditions. Apple and Samsung were getting their cobalt from a mine in Democratic Republic of Congo, and someone went in and exposed the fact that they were using child labor, 3 or 4 years old, to go out and fill bags. other places where there are landmines. And so the companies want to stop using these places as a source for their material. Then the economy of that place is left with nothing. So again, we kind of go into the round, but as you can see, the economies are growing, the natural resources are continually being discovered, and they could actually really rival China, if they were able to have an economic forum where they could work together. And as you can see, there's still a lot of oil and gas being found, in sub-Saharan Africa. Ethiopia wants to open a new power plant, a new coal power plant to spark industry, and they have reserves of coal that is right there. But people are trying to talk them out of, building it. And hopefully some collaboration will come about that will help countries to move forward without, I think, that they need if we're expecting them not to use hydrocarbons. All right. Now we are going to move to North Africa and Southwest Asia. There are two things that define this place. The first, go back, it's plate tectonics. Now, we just looked at the spreading center here in Africa, where the ground was opening up and the volcanoes were coming up and the fertile soil. And if you look at the Arabian plate where Saudi Arabia is, every border along the entire slide there is a plate subducting, and all of those dashed lines are mountains that are being produced. So this area is extremely tectonically active. They have multiple earthquakes. Some of the areas are constructed really well, so there's little damage. Other areas, like in Iran, if they have a devastating earthquake, the buildings aren't very safe. So the whole thing right now, basically to the north, is building itself up. Okay, so let's look at some of these bodies of water that we have here. The Red Sea to the north, there is the Suez Canal, and that is an area under control by Egypt. So if you want to move from the Mediterranean into the Red, you have to go through there. If you look south, you will find between the Gulf of Aden and the Red Sea, another small area. It's an area where only two ships can pass by at a time. An area like this is called a choke point because things can get backed up right there. And it's also an area which would be very strategic to either have investments in, because you have control of a shipping lane at that point. If you look at the Persian Gulf, and then there's the Strait of Hormuz, that's another strategic area, since the Persian Gulf has so much oil and gas exploration and tankers that whoever owns the area right there is going to have money and be part of the decisions on travel that happens in that area. Very strategic locations. Second feature that controls North Africa is water. They call this area the dry area. And even though we see that we have oceans and we have gulfs and stuff like that, there are very few lakes and rivers in this area. Also, when we learned about aquifers, we talked about the fact that they are underground layers that have water in them that you can put a well in and suck the water out. Well, we learned about fossil aquifers, and they're ones that were filled with water a really long time ago, fossil water, and then there's no way for water to get down to refill it. So once it's dry, once you've sucked all the water out of it, it's not going to recharge, and it's not going to be good for anything. So This area is very arid and it's very water poor. And it's one of the reasons why places like Saudi Arabia will go to a country in the South Pacific or in Sub-Saharan Africa and grow their crops there for their people and then send them back for their people to have food. The Nile here, the Nile starts as the blue and white Nile, and then it flows down through Egypt. If you look at the population map right here, you'll see that this highly populated area along the path of the Nile and the Delta is where people are living, heavily populated because they have access to water. That's where the agriculture is. All right. So for centuries, the waters at the heads of the white and blue Nile were sufficient glaciers, snow melt and everything. And again, we've talked about how when the water comes down, the snow melt from the highlands, not only does this bring water, but the very fertile volcanic silt is carried down with it. And so when it reaches the Nile Valley in Egypt, they would build these structures that would allow it to overflow the banks. And then you would not only have areas with water, but you would have this very fertile silt on top of it that would help your crops grow. But see, later dams were built upstream, and it's always the upstream people of the dams who have the power of the upstream of the rivers. I mean, so Ethiopia has built one of the great dams, is building it, and they're currently, it's not an action yet. It's going to be for hydroelectric power, so clean energy, and also to help get a reservoir of water there in cases of drought. But while they're filling the reservoir behind it, Egypt and Sudan are not getting their share of water that was agreed upon further down to the south. So this has been a really tense situation that's going on right now with the water. They want to place locks in it so it's navigable, so you can still use it as an area for transportation. But it's a very serious situation right now, and Turkey has said that it wants to create a series of 22 dams on the Nile. So this is going to have to work out in the world court somewhere, I think. All right. Here's a slide that talks about the fact that Muslim rule did spread across this area. And this is one of the places where it really took. Now, as they migrated across Northern Africa and the Ottoman Empire, and then they went down through India, which we're going to see, they also went as far away as Indonesia. And Indonesia is the country with the world's largest Muslim population in the world. But it was brought through and it was offered as a local start off. I want to say local, but because it happened in Medina and Mecca and in Saudi Arabia, it was an area born religion that people started to grab onto. Now we have to look at some terms before we go any further of how normally we would talk about these areas. I call it the Middle East, and that's because I consider it a functioning region. They may have differences, but basically they're all oil states and and have similar type governments. So, and they're functioning together. The word Arab actually just means someone who speaks the Arabic language. So Arabs are just people who speak Arabic. Islam or Islamic, these are the people who are Muslim. So when I talk about the Middle East, I'm talking about this functioning region. If I use the word Arab, I'm not talking about an ethnicity. I'm talking about someone who's their language. And Islam are people who are Muslim. So that's important to know the difference for these because a lot of times they're used interchangeably. Now, excuse me, let's look at the oil uh, situation. So the economy has challenges that are being faced because of the lack of large scale resources in these areas, except for oil and gas. And oil is the large majority of the Middle East. Venezuela has #1 reserves, but 6 other of the Middle Eastern countries are in the top 10 of having the largest reserves. So you can look along and see where, starting in Algeria and Libya and then moving east, that you have all of these oil fields that are being produced right now. Some changes that came to this area as oil became discovered and became a moneymaker. One is that there were urban transformations, like all of a sudden modernized cities were being built, and so you started actually having kind of suburbs around them, which is much different than where you would find people like in a family compound in other areas. A second one is infrastructure. Because there's so much here, they spent some money to do the airports, the seaports, the utilities, and the roads. Industrialization, because they're working on all of these oil fields, they are now looking into other industries to replace it because they know that oil won't last forever. At some point, we're going to switch over from it. There's highlighted regional disparities. If you look at Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, those who are very, very, very rich, have a lot of resources. And then you look at Yemen to the south, which has very few. Yemen right now is one of the 5 poorest countries in the world. It's a failed state. There's no government there structure that is feeding the people or protecting the people. So even in an area where you have neighbors who may follow a similar religion or speak the same language, shows that the oil is not divided equally, and that there are areas in here that are very desperately poor. One of the things that oil also brought was foreign investment, business people, machines, and working on globalizing the economy. And one of the things that a lot of the people who were devout Muslims were, they didn't want the Western influences to be brought into their culture to change the way that they live. And so when uh, when I applied for a job in Saudi Arabia to work at an oil company, they had an entire compound that was just as if you were in the United States. It had pools and shopping centers and movie theaters and everything, and it's highly fortified and highly guarded, because there are more than 11 million non-Saudi Arabians in the country working right now. So it was good for the people to feel like they had a culture, but it's also the fact that it's kept separated so that what's in there doesn't affect the day-to-day life of the people who don't want it to affect their day-to-day life. So even with all the foreign investments and people and stuff like that, I think they're finding a way to balance to see if that's what the people of their country want. So let's look at the Saudi Arabian Peninsula some more and talk about how the fact that oil is not going to last forever, and what the country is doing about it, or what the countries on the Saudi Arabian Peninsula are doing to diversify their economy so that they can continue to prosper. The rest of Saudi Arabia is a desert. It's undeveloped and oil doesn't reach here. But if you look at production, it's on the northeast side. That's where along the Persian Gulf and down around through Oman, where you have the majority of it. Nobody pretty much lives in the middle of the country, and then you have few living along the coast. So what and because there is a large young population of unemployed people in Saudi Arabia, and they want them to be continue to be integrated in the culture, what they decided to do was create these 6 new economic cities, 4 of which are on the western part of the country, and they're building universities and industrial complexes, educate and employ. They're looking at ways in these places not only where they can educate and bring the younger Saudi Arabians into being involved in the economy, but it will also diversify the economy. So it will help bring unity to the workers, but also 20 years from now, what will they be working on? Now, a lot of the states on the Arabian Peninsula besides Saudi Arabia are actively working to diversify. Now, so we talked about Yemen and how absolutely poor it is. If you look at Bahrain, Bahrain has become an international banking center. It still has oil and gas reserves for something so extraordinarily small, but it's looking towards the future. And because there's so much money there in that region, it's a good place to set up financial institution. The United Arab Emirates, the UAE, right now they are huge on tourism. They have the tallest building in the world, which is 2,700 feet tall. They are into trade and banking, engineering. They have one of the world's largest theme parks. They have the world's longest zip line. They have it's like a rich people's playground there. They have it's for expensive entertainment, but it's also available to anybody who wants to go. You don't have to be rich to go, but you could certainly spend money there. So they're diversifying in a very different way than I would have thought of. Disney World makes a lot of money, so if I don't feel like opening a banking center, then make it one of the most fun places in the world to visit. You can see Oman. Oman is strategic here. It has the large portion of its country, and then it breaks off, and it has the very tip near the Strait of Hormuz. So if a ship breaks down or anything like that, they will stop and have to go to Oman first. That to me was pretty strategic. All right. So I'm going to wrap up right now with a few things about climate and climate change in the area. Right now, the fact that it's a desert and the fact that it's hard to grow food is huge. And the fact that it's only supposed to get hotter and drier with longer droughts is not going to go away there anytime soon. Some areas are already unlivable as drying continues. Some areas may become unlivable, and so you may have to have people moving to another area. Some good things that are happening though is that Saudi Arabia is working on really big desalination. One of the problems with that is that when you desalinize it, the waste that's left over, the salts and everything can be toxic. But researchers are finding that you can actually take some of the waste and you can use it to create something safe. And so that would help a long way to places, Saudi Arabia and other places where there are deserts, where they would actually be able to have affordable, clean water, plentiful, affordable, clean water to their people. So, all right. Well, I hope that you enjoyed this lecture, and halfway through the class. It's crazy. If you need anything, I just say send me an email or give me a call and I'll make sure I get back to you. All right. It's going to be a great week.